In last week's video, I showed you how to capture the Rosette Nebula with the Go-To mount and the ASAR Pro. Today, I'm going to show you how to process those photos. Since I'm on Windows, I'm going to use an application called DeepSkyStacker to stack everything together. If you're on a Mac, you can always use an application like StarrySkyStacker. That one's going to work largely the same. Either way though, you can still follow along with us, and then eventually we're going to be over in Photoshop. The first thing I want to do is click Open Picture Files on the left. Then I can navigate to my folder with all of my FITS files. In this case, I've already copied all these off of the flash drive of the ASAR Pro onto my computer. And I can just select all my FITS files and then hit Open. One of the great things about using the ASAR Pro and an electronic filter wheel is it actually goes through and names each one of my light frames. In this case, I've got my H-alpha light frames, my oxygen, and my sulfur. If you have a manual filter drawer or something like that, you would not have this luxury, and you'd have to make sure you go through and independently name them. So that is one nice benefit of having an electronic filter wheel. With all of our photos loaded in, the first thing I want to do is just go through it and rate all of my images with a score. That way I can see if any photos are blurry and get rid of them. The way to do that is to hit Check All over on the left. This will put a little check mark next to every single light frame that you took for the night. Then we can click on Register Checked Pictures in red. That should bring up this window here. And all you really have to do is uncheck Stack After Registering. That's really all there is to it. It might not be a bad idea to also click on Advanced and compute the number of detected stars. It's going to go through and look at one of your images and see how many stars it finds. If it finds 0, for example, that would be a problem. If it finds 2,000 to 10,000 plus, that would also be a problem. So move the slider around. The higher the star detection threshold number is, the less stars you're going to find. It's kind of weird. I normally recommend starting off at 20% maybe, and then adjusting that as needed. Again, in my case, 276 stars. If we just glance at the photo, that looks about right. With our star detection threshold looking good, we'll go back to the Actions tab. Again, all you really have to do is uncheck this Stack After Registering box and then hit OK. Now it's going to go through and register. In other words, it's going to look at the photo, it's going to identify how big the stars are, and it's going to give it a rating. Once this process is complete, we can then go through, look for any bad photos, get rid of them, and then move on with the workflow. All right, we're all done there. And now if we look here in the center, we see a score. As I scroll down, we're starting to get an understanding of what the average number is. For my H-alpha filters, the average score is around 2,000. The lower the number, the worse the photo is. Here's one that says 1676. That might indicate that we have slightly less sharp stars, but that's still a really high score. If you find a value like 200 or less, that might indicate a problem. And therefore, I'm just going to scroll down and look for anything that's really a lower number than anything else. And then if I use my cursor, I can hover over and get a really high-res crop in the top left to make sure the stars are actually sharp or not. I'm not really seeing any problems though. And that's one of the nice things about having this Go-To mount with the auto guider running is that I get really good tracking results. These were all 5-minute long exposures at about 500 millimeters. So that's a good sign that I'm getting really good results out of that Go-To mount. And to be honest, I don't see any blurry photos here. Nothing is really sticking out. So I think we're all ready to go. Now that we've registered and scored all of our photos, that's the first part of the workflow done. The next part is to figure out which frame we're going to use as our reference frame. In other words, let me just show you our first photo here. Note where the stars are at in this photo. I might also have, if I bring up the gain here. That's something else I should mention. The upper right corner, if you really want to see the stars a little bit better, you can move this midpoint slider to the left to bring out more detail. What I was getting at though, is that if the stars are right here in this photo, where are they at in this photo? See how much they've jumped around, and then this photo. So what we're trying to do is pick a photo where the stars are more or less in the center. That way we can use this as our reference frame, and every single photo will be aligned to this position. In this case, I really like where the stars are at here compared to over here. They're too far up in the upper left corner. I want them more or less dead center. So I'm just going to kind of scan through here, find the image that's close enough to the center. And once I've determined which image is going to work best, I can right click on it and then use as reference frame. After I click use as reference frame, there's a little asterisk next to the score. That means every single photo today is going to be lined up to this particular image, and it'll make our night a lot easier when we get into Photoshop. So that's kind of like step 2. We've chosen our reference frame. Now we're ready for step 3, which is our stacking. I like to keep things nice and simple, and I also don't like wasting a lot of time. So I actually have not taken any dark, bias, or flat frames because, as you can see here, I don't have any vignette, I don't have any dust spots, there's not really any amp glow to be seen or any serious problems. I was also dithering when I was taking my photos. If you recall, dithering is where the camera moves very slightly after every single photo, and you can see that right now. It's pretty subtle, but it's definitely occurring. The stars are moving a little bit. And the end result of this dithering is that when we stack all the photos up to this singular location, it will average out and remove any serious problems for the most part. In other words, because I was dithering, I don't necessarily need dark or bias frames. That's not to say that you shouldn't take them and include them in your stack. It's really just up to your own individual shooting style and the gear you're using. So in my case, I'm not going to use them, but it's still probably a good idea to include those photos in your stack if you think they might become a problem later on. Anyway, I'm just going to stack my light frames today, and that'll make things a little bit easier. So at this point, everything is still selected, all of my light frames, and I don't want that. I can just hit uncheck all over on the left, and we're just going to start at the top. I'll select my first H-alpha photo, scroll down, hold down the shift key, and click on my last H-alpha photo. That way all of the H-alpha filters are selected. Then I can right click and check. I've now selected all of my H-alpha photos but nothing else. Then I'll go over to the left and hit register checked pictures. I'm going to uncheck the box that says register already registered pictures. In other words, right now it'd go through and rate all the photos all over again, which is pointless. We've already done it. So that's just wasting time. I'm going to uncheck that. I do need to check stack after registering though. Otherwise it won't actually do anything. Now that we have stack after registering checked, you could change the amount of photos to stack. In my case, because I looked at the scores, I know every single photo is sharp, so I'm going to stack 100% of my images. If you're not quite sure though, you could always lower this to maybe 90%, and now it's going to find 10% of your photos that have the lowest score and not include them. That's up to you. But in my case, I want as much data as possible, even if it's not quite as sharp as it could be. From here, we'll go down to our recommended settings button, click on it, and then verify that we have our correct algorithm. In my case, I'm using the Sigma clipping, and if you see 2 blue hyperlinks, you can just click on it, click on one or the other, and that will automatically select it for you. In my case, Sigma clipping should give me a good result. That tends to throw out a lot of the junk that might get in the photo, like planes, satellites, hot pixels, things like that. So Sigma clipping works really well. Unfortunately, this algorithm only works well if you have at least 20 photos, and sometimes you might only have 10 or 15 images. In that case, you'd probably want to go with the median option, and you would see that listed here. If you had less than 20 images, it would say like median or average. I would just click on median. Everything else looks fine though. I'll hit OK. Then I'll hit OK one more time. This is our last chance to look things over before it actually goes through. I have almost 3 hours worth of H-alpha data. That's really good. I don't have any bias, dark, or flat frames. No big deal for me. And then I'll hit OK. It's now going to go through and stack all 32 of my H-alpha photos. Once that's complete, I'm going to repeat this process for oxygen and sulfur. And then after we have our stacked H-alpha, sulfur, and oxygen images, we can take those into Photoshop. And this would be the same process if you had RGB data instead. You would just take your R data, stack it, your blue data, stack it, and your green data, stack it, just like we're doing here. And this is all being done, of course, with a monochrome camera, which means I'm only getting one wavelength at a time, or one range of wavelengths. If you had a color camera, then you really wouldn't have to worry about this too much. You would just stack all your photos at once and be done with it. But the monochrome does take a little bit more work at the cost of having a better photo, which is obviously a good thing. So there we go. our H alpha photo has finished stacking. Over on the left, I want to hit Save Picture to File. This will allow me to save it as a 16-bit TIFF. And we'll call this H alpha 3 today. Everything else here looks good. I'm going to embed adjustments, but do not apply them. 16-bit TIFF image, and then hit Save. After you've saved your 16-bit TIFF file, if you go up to the left where it says Register and Stacking in bold, you can click on that. And we're back to our beginning interface. The easiest way to proceed from here is to click Uncheck All on the left. With all of our photos unchecked, we're going to scroll down to our oxygen set of photos. I'll click on the first oxygen photo, hold down the Shift key, click on the last one, and then right-click, check. Everything else should already be set from before, so if we go back to Register Checked Pictures, I'm going to uncheck this box here. I'm going to click Recommended Settings just to verify that it's set correctly. It is. Then I'll hit OK. I have 2 hours and 20 minutes of data, a little bit less than the H alpha. That might lead to some grain in the final image, but we'll find out. I'll hit OK. Same thing here, it's going to go through and stack all the oxygen photos. So you can see after you get through that initial part of the workflow, it really speeds up, and we can be done here in about 5 minutes or less at this point. Our oxygen filter has finished saving. Same thing here, I'm going to click Save Picture to File. We'll call this Oxygen. Hit Save. Go back to Registering and Stacking. Uncheck All. Scroll down to our sulfur images, click on the first one, hold down Shift, click on the last one, right-click, check, and then finally Register Checked Pictures, go through the same thing we've been doing. That all looks good. Looks like I almost have 3 hours of sulfur, which is nice because there's really not a lot of sulfur coming from the Rosette Nebula, and therefore we do need a lot more data so we don't have as much grain. Once this guy's complete though, we'll save it as a TIFF, and then at that point we have our 3 color channels that we can take into Photoshop and begin the real post-processing work. You know the drill by now. Save picture to file, call this one Sulfur 3, save it. Now we can close out of DeepSkyStacker. We're all done in there. We'll hit no, we don't need to save anything. And then we're ready to move on to Photoshop. I'm also going to navigate to my folder where I have everything saved. Delete the autosaves because they're not really of any use to us. We save them as 16-bit TIFFs. The autosaves are just taking up room. Then I can open up my H alpha 3 just by double clicking on it. That'll bring us into Photoshop. I've also got my oxygen and then finally the sulfur 3. You might be thinking, well, this doesn't look very good. We can barely even see any stars at all. But that's because we haven't really done anything yet. The way you want to approach this is choose your foundational image. In other words, you can work on the H alpha image, oxygen, or sulfur. I normally just go with H alpha though, that makes it easier for me. After I've chosen H alpha, I'll go up to Image, Mode, and we're going to change this from grayscale to RGB color. That's ultimately what's going to allow us to take monochrome images and turn them into a final color photo. When I click on RGB color, I can now move over to the Channels tab in the lower right. When I click on Channels, I see red, green, and blue. At this point though, they're all technically containing the black and white H alpha data. It's a very simple process though to turn that into a color photo. And the way to do this is depending on your own personal preference. Let me show you what I actually like to do. I do have oxygen and sulfur. I'm only going to grab my oxygen data though. With the oxygen tab selected, I'll hit Controller Command A to select everything. Controller Command C to copy that data. I've now just copied all of the oxygen data. I'll go back to my halpha.tiff. And I'm actually going to paste the oxygen into green and blue by hitting Controller Command V to paste that data in. In this case, I'll hit Controller Command V to paste it in on green, and then I'll do the same thing on blue, Controller Command V. Now that might sound kind of weird. I've got H alpha data on red, and I've got oxygen data on green and blue. But let's see what happens. If I click the eyeball for RGB, Then I'll click back on my Layers button. Finally, I'll hit Control or Command D to deselect everything. This is where it gets kind of fun. If we go up to our Adjustments tab, if you don't have an Adjustments tab, go to Window, and then click on Adjustments, and that'll bring it up somewhere on the screen. I'd recommend though that you kind of get it looking like my interface because that's pretty easy to work with. But with our Adjustments tab, we're going to click on Levels. Levels is going to be top row, second from the left. And the way this works is we have a little tiny spike here on the left. That means all of our data is contained in this little dark area, and that's why the image looks the way it does. To fix that, I can just move the midpoint slider here to the left, maybe right about there. Then I'll hit Control-Shift-Alt-E, or Command-Shift-Option-E if you're on a Mac. You want to make sure you hit that key combination to create a new layer. That's the easiest way to do it. Again, Control-Shift-Alt-E, Command-Shift-Option-E. Either way, that should work. And we're going to repeat that process one more time. Adjustments, add a Levels. This time now we have 2 spikes. That's a good sign. I'll move the black point to the right, the midpoint to the left. Control-Shift-Alt-E. From here, we have an overly red color cast, which is to be expected. That's fairly easy to fix as well. If I go back to my Adjustments, I'll click on the Curves button, which is in the middle of the top row. Over on the left, we have 3 droppers: black point, midpoint, white point. I'll click on the black point dropper. With the black point dropper selected, I can now click anywhere in the photo that should be black, and obviously we have a lot of flexibility there. Maybe somewhere right over here. If I click there, look at that, we've now neutralized the color cast and also fixed the contrast. Although to be honest, I don't really like the contrast adjustments too much. Therefore, I'm going to change the blending mode from normal, and that's located right here. Change that from normal to color. That way it's only applying the color adjustments to the photo. Now that we're only affecting the color, I could try using the black point dropper again and maybe get a little bit more accurate. So I'll just click on it and then click somewhere else in the photo. And every time I click, it's going to change the color balance of the photo. So do it until it looks good to your eye. I think right about there it looks okay. I'm going to keep moving along, go back to my Adjustments, add another Curves layer. And this time I'm going to use the Hand tool right here. With the Hand tool selected, we can zoom in and choose what we want to make brighter or darker. For example, I really want to bring out the detail here and make it brighter. So I'll click and drag my mouse upwards. Then I need to find an area that should be darker, which is most of the sky. I can click and drag downwards, like so. And this allows you to really target the contrast, and look at that, that looks pretty cool. I do recommend when you're doing this though, to look at your graph over on the right. And because I have a straight line at the top, that means I'm clipping the data in the stars. Very simply, just click and add a point to the graph, drag it down to roll it off, and that'll help prevent the stars from getting too big and bright. But with that one curves adjustment, we took the image a long way. And I am noticing a little bit of glow in the corners. I think this is because of my camera's sensor. And this would be a good PSA on taking dark frames, because if you take your dark frames, that should identify this glow and remove it when you're doing your photo stacking. As I mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily a bad idea, even if you're dithering, to include some of those calibration frames, especially if you're noticing a lot of vignette right now. This is really when it would start to become a problem. So if you do notice some weird problems, maybe some banding, or in this case a glow or a vignette, then you might want to go back, redo the stacking process, but this time include those calibration frames. In my case though, I'm not really worried about it. I can always fix it later on. The point being here though, was that I took 2 colors, H-alpha and oxygen, and I now have a beautiful full color image of the Rosette Nebula that looks pretty darn cool. Let's take it a step back though. I did capture sulfur data and I'm not using it, so why don't we make a full narrowband color image? And for that, we're going to start all the way over again. I know we're kind of breaking up the workflow a little bit. I just wanted to show you that you can still create a beautiful photo, even if you only have 2 color channels, in this case, H-alpha and oxygen. You don't always necessarily need that 3rd color channel. If you'd like to start over as well, the easiest way to do that is to click on your History tab, and then click on the file name at the very top. That will reset everything back to the very beginning. And just like before, we'll go up to Image, Mode, and change it from grayscale to RGB color. Then we can click on Channels on the lower right, and from here, you want to think about what filter you're going to put into each color. In other words, maybe I want to put H alpha on green, sulfur on red, and oxygen on blue. There's a lot of different color combinations you can do. If we just head over to Google, there's a lot of great articles, especially from Trevor over at Astro Backyard. If we take a look at what he talks about, I think he kind of lays it out pretty well. If we scroll down, we see right here, he's talking about the Hubble palette. And in this case, if you want to do the Hubble palette, like you see those photos from NASA and things like that, you would put sulfur on red, H alpha on green, oxygen on blue. But you're free to adjust that as needed. In my case, I think that's what we'll try today. Therefore, I'll hit Controller Command A on my oxygen, Controller Command C to copy it, and we'll paste our oxygen on blue. Then we'll grab our sulfur data with Controller Command A, Controller Command C to copy that, paste that on red. And because H alpha was already here, we didn't put anything on green, that's already taken care of. Finally, we'll click RGB, go back to our layers, hit Controller Command D, and now we're going to repeat that process with the levels. We'll add a new one, move the midpoint over to the left, Control Shift Alt E, adjustments, levels, move our sliders around, Control Shift Alt E, and this is looking pretty gnarly. This is actually the way my first Rosette Nebula photo looked in Narrowband about a year ago. It was just very green and not exactly the best color scheme. Let's see if we can work with that though. And from here I'll go back to my adjustments, add a curves layer, click on my black point dropper, click somewhere in the sky, and we've now just neutralized that overly green color cast. Then I can change the blending mode from normal to color. And that's not looking terrible. We can work with that. Finally, I'll go back to my adjustments, add a new curves layer, click on the hand tool. I realize I'm going through this fast, but we've already covered it. And you can always go back and rewatch the video if you're still kind of new to this. But with the hand tool selected, we'll bring up the blues a little bit, bring down the darks, really add some good contrast there. And the more editing you do, the more those problems are going to become visible. In my case, I think this is the amp glow as I mentioned. So this is going to become more and more of a problem because I did not include those dark frames in the stack just because I haven't taken dark frames yet and I figured we'd see how it turned out. But if you are noticing those problems, again, you might want to go back, restack your photos with maybe your flat frames or your dark frames, or your bias frames, or all three, whatever you need to do. At this point, I think we've got a fairly good image, or at least a base starting layer. You know, I can always work with it from here. If I add one more curves layer though, I can continue to add a little bit more contrast just to make that stand out a bit better. If you're happy with the overall contrast of the image, then from here, let's try a selective color. This is what's going to allow us to tweak the overall color channels in the image. And for that, I'll click on selective color, which is going to be bottom row, second from the right, in our adjustments tab. The way selective color works is you've got different color channels, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, etc. In this case, I'm noticing a lot of green in the photo, so let's try that. After I click on green, I'm just going to move the sliders left and right to either subdue or enhance the colors in the photo. And this is entirely up to you, because this is narrowband. It's not real colors at this point. It's whatever we want it to be. And therefore, you can have fun with it. I would probably go with a color bounce, though, that shows the most definition. That's kind of the whole point of the Hubble palette, is to show that definition. And I think that looks okay. With the green color channel fixed, I'll go down to yellows. And I'll repeat that same process. Just move the sliders left and right and look at the photo. That's really all I'm doing. There's no set answer here. After you're good with yellows, we'll go down to cyan. Same drill. And then finally, we can just look at the other color channels and see if we even notice any of those colors. I'm not really seeing much red or magenta, so there's probably not going to be much effect on the image. There might be a little bit of blue though. I've now completed one selective color layer, but that doesn't mean I can't do it again. And that's usually a pretty good tip. So you can always go back to your adjustments, add another selective color, and continue to stack these changes. For example, on this new selective color, I can go back to the yellows and continue to really make them more orangish, which I could never do with just a single selective color. this is a very powerful way to continue to edit your photo. And at this point, I'm almost reminded of the Grand Prismatic Spring over in Yellowstone. It looks just like this with the different colors. And maybe that's kind of the route I want to go down, now that I'm starting to see something coming out of the nebula. And if you're not familiar with that, let's do a quick image search here. Here we can see the spring over in Yellowstone. And there's actually a lot of similarities now that I'm thinking about it. We've got the blues, the oranges, the reds, the greens. And I'm noticing mine is a pale comparison of that, but we can make it work. I can go to the greens, maybe add a little bit more green or less, and then we'll go back to cyan. And you're free to continue to do as many of these as you want. Just make sure you're not oversaturating any colors. That can be fairly easy to do. In this case, I think that looks pretty cool right there. If you're ready to move on with the workflow, we'll hit Control-Shift-Alt-E again, or Command-Shift-Option-E if you're on a Mac. That should create a new layer. And this is a good starting point for the rest of our edits. In this case, I think I'll work on the noise reduction next. For that, we'll go up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. Even though I've got a total of like 6 hours at least in this photo, there's still some color grain in the photo because when you're working in narrowband, there's hardly any light coming in. So in Camera Raw, if I click on the Detail tab, I can adjust the noise reduction as well as the color noise reduction. And you're going to want to do these usually one at a time. So with the color noise reduction slider, we're going to move it up until the pixelated colors start to disappear. Ideally, you can keep this number as low as possible. Otherwise, you're going to start killing the actual color in the photo. 25, though, is a safe bet for your color noise reduction. After you've got the color noise reduction slider figured out, then you can move up to the normal noise reduction and increase that one as well. Just be careful you don't go too far here. Maybe max out around 20 as well for the noise reduction. And that doesn't look half bad. If you want to play things safe, you could just hit OK. And this is probably the best way to do things where you're doing one edit at a time. So there's our before the noise reduction and after. It's definitely a marked improvement. I want to make sure I'm staying organized as well. And the way to do that is to double click where it says Layer 4. And then we'll call this Noise Reduction. That way if I come back tomorrow, I'll actually know what this layer does. Now we're ready to move on and do some more edits with Control-Shift-Alt-E. That creates a new layer that's a composite of everything we've done. And that works really well for me. With Layer 4, let's do a star reduction. We'll call this Star Reduction. If you've been doing astrophotography for a while, then you know there's a ton of different star reduction techniques out there. Some can be done as little as 3 seconds. Others can take upwards of 15 to 20 minutes. And it's up to you to decide which route you want to go down, if you want to do any star reduction at all. In my case, I think we'll stick with the more traditional route and see how that turns out. And for that, we'll go up to Select, Color Range. This is going to allow us to choose the highlights or the stars and only apply those edits to that area. When you get the color range window opened up, make sure the selection preview is set to grayscale. That way you can see the full screen preview. And then choose Select, Highlights. From here, you can move the fuzziness and range sliders around. Everything that's white will be selected. Everything that's black will not be selected. And the way you want to think about this is you don't want the nebula selected, only the stars. So adjust the sliders until you get something like that. And then you can hit OK. Next, we'll zoom in till we can see the stars up close. Probably over here would be a good spot. And you want to verify that the little dotted lines are actually covering up the entire star. In this case, they're a little bit inside the boundary of the star. To fix that, we'll go up to Select, Modify, and we're going to expand the size of that circle. The value is usually 2 to 3 to 4 pixels. It really just depends on your image. I might go with 3 today. That's a little bit beyond the edge of the star, but I think it'll work okay. From here, we'll go back to Select, Modify, and we need to feather that selection a little bit. That way there's no hard edges, and that should give you a better final result. When you click on Feather, it's going to ask you for a radius. The general idea is to put about half the value that you did earlier. So if you did 3, this would be 1.5. You can always feel free to adjust it as needed, but again, half the value of your expansion tends to work pretty well. The only thing left is to actually apply our star reduction. And for that, we'll go up to Filter, other, minimum. This is just one way to do your star reduction. There's a lot of other ways to do it though, but this is kind of like the standard option. The radius is going to depend entirely on your image. There's no right or wrong answer here. Well, there is. If you go too far with the radius, you're going to get really ugly black splotches throughout the photo. So you don't want to put this up too high. And you can see there we're getting the black splotches at 24 pixels. Therefore, I'd probably want to lower this anywhere from 0.5 pixels on the low end. Like if you're doing wide angle images, usually 0.5, you have to be around there or else you start getting the dark splotches. All the way up to maybe 2 or 3 pixels at the highest. It's really just up to you to experiment and see what works well. I think we'll go with 3.5 today because things look pretty good. And then I'll hit OK. Finally, we'll hit Control-Command-D to deselect everything. And then we'll zoom out. And that had a massive impact on the image. Here's our before. I think it looks fine before, to be honest. But after, the stars disappear, and that usually allows your eye to focus in on the nebula a little bit better and really make out the dust clouds in more detail. Just be careful when you're doing this before and after that you don't find any problem areas. Like see over here we have the splotches I didn't notice before. That could be a problem. And maybe you decide you went too far on your radius. If you notice a splotchy problem like that, then the easiest solution would be to click on your History tab and then click above minimum. That will undo it. After we click above minimum, in this case on feather, we can just go back and go to Filter, Other, Minimum. And we know 3.7 was too high, so we can lower that to maybe 2. That looks a little bit better. It's not nearly as splotchy. Then I'll hit OK. Remember, hit Control-Command-D to deselect the marching ants. Zoom out. And there we go. That's not nearly as intense, and I think it looks all right. I think we'll go with that for right now with our star reduction. I'm not a big fan of it, to be honest. Normally I like it better. Today I'm not really digging it, but whatever. My next goal is just to crop the image because the amp glow corners are getting annoying. With my crop tool selected, I'm just going to drag in the corners, and we'll just focus in on the Rosette Nebula. And I didn't have to waste all that time digging the dark frames because they're no longer even applicable. We cropped it out. I think the only thing left is to draw out the nebula a little bit better. And for that, I'll hit Control-Shift-Alt-E to create a new layer. We'll call this layer High Pass. And this will bring out more of those details in the nebula. We'll do Filter, Other, High Pass. After you click on High Pass, you can adjust the radius to match the image. In other words, you want to increase it until you can see the dust clouds coming out. If you go too far, it might look something like this, and that's not going to work. Just adjust the radius until you can see the finer details in the dust clouds, and don't go much further than that. Maybe in my case around, I think 12 should work fine. The image is going to look really weird now because we did our high pass filter, but we didn't change anything. The way to solve that is to click on Normal, our blending mode, and change it from Normal to Overlay. Now that the high pass is changed to overlay, if we turn it on and off, you can see that really brings out the definition of the dust clouds, which looks pretty nice. If you think you overdid it though, you can always lower the opacity of this layer to maybe 50% or less, whatever you think looks good to you. In my case, I don't want this high pass filter to affect the stars because I only want it to apply to the dust cloud. The way around that is to add a layer mask down below. There's a little box with a circle in the middle. That'll add a white layer mask. Then I can hit Control-Command-I to invert it. Whenever you see a black layer mask, that means it's not applying to the image. From here, I can grab a white paintbrush and just paint in the nebula. If you're not familiar with layer masks yet, there's a lot of good videos here on YouTube. I recommend you go watch them about layer masks. That will make this a lot easier. And here you can see my layer mask. I've painted in the high pass filter only in on the nebula itself. However, this is a very big mistake I see a lot of people make because they don't blur out their layer masks, and it's very obvious when you look at their photo, you can tell what they did. To fix that, we'll go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. We're going to blur out the layer mask so that way nobody can even tell that there's any edits that have been applied as long as you do this correctly. When you click the minus button a bunch of times, you'll be able to see your layer mask here. And I recommend just increasing the radius until it's more of a soft edge like that, then hit OK. If we turn on and off the eyeball one more time, that looks really nice right there. And this would be a good time to save the photo because we haven't really done that yet. I'll go File, Save As, and we'll call this one Narrowband 1. I'm actually having some really strong deja vu right now, which is kind of weird. I remembered going through this edit like we've done it before, but maybe I'm just going crazy. I think this turned out really well, all things considered. I normally am not a big fan of the Hubble palette. Like I said, I normally like to just use 2 colors, that we can get the red colors out of the Rosette Nebula. But this turned out pretty nice as well. There's a few other things we can do before we call it a day, and for that we'll hit Control-Shift-Alt-E one more time to create a new layer. I'll call this layer Dodge. And there's a lot of ways you can do your dodging. I'm going to show you the simplest way to do it. Over on the left, you should see a dodge tool if you click and hold down here. The dodge is going to make things brighter. Burn would make them darker. If I click on dodge, up top I can choose the range, either shadows, midtones, or highlights. That means I can target just the highlights in the photo or just the shadows or whatever I want to do. I'm going to go with the highlights this time. For the exposure, you want this really low, 3 to 5% at the most. Otherwise it's going to be way too much. And then the size of the brush, that just depends on your image. I think around 200 works for me. Then we can zoom in. And I'm just going to click and drag my mouse over the nebula, and you can immediately see that it's making it brighter. There's our before and after. See how it really just draws your eye to the center of the nebula a little bit better than it did before? I can continue to adjust the brush size and just paint in exactly where I want these changes. Make sure you're doing this very carefully though, because if you're not paying attention, you can easily ruin the photo. Not a big deal, you can always undo it, but just be careful and just go little by little. If you think you've done a nice pass, you can turn on and off the eyeball, see how it looks. In this case, I think that was a really nice job. Maybe just a little bit more. And if I want to next, I can change over to the midtones and repeat the process. So with the midtones selected, I can continue to paint in the nebula. If we do our before and after one more time, you can see that that really had a subtle impact, but an important one. If you think you overdid it though, just feel free to go to the opacity slider and move it down. Maybe 30 to 70%, whatever you think looks good. I'll probably leave it around 80. And my final thing I'll do here is to add a new curves layer. Click on the hand tool and just make the sky a little bit darker because right now it's not quite black. Same deal here. If I think I overdid it on the contrast a little bit, I'll just move the opacity down. And that looks good to me. Now that I think I'm finished with the image, I'll save it one more time. And before I post this online anywhere, I'm going to give it a day to rest, because if I come back and look at this tomorrow, I might decide that I don't like the color balance, or that the dodge was too extreme, or that I need a vignette, or anything else. It's always a good idea to just let the image sit for a day, come back and look at it with fresh eyes, and then either continue your editing or save it as a JPEG. And that about does it for today's video. I hope you're able to follow along with us step by step and you didn't get too lost, but if you did, don't worry about it. Even me, when I'm watching other people's tutorials, they tend to go a bit fast, and I have to rewatch portions of the video over and over again until I have some idea of what they're doing. So that's totally normal, but the more practice you get, the more these different concepts are going to really start to click, and you'll be up and running, and you can do your own workflows much more easy.